Welcome, everybody. We're back. David here with this week's Griscom stream. Stoked to be here. We had a big and fun show on Tuesday. Definitely be sure to check that out with surprise guest Ben Burgess along with Jean Bachelon. We talked a little bit about the Cornell West run for the presidency. We also had Alex Hochuli on the program as well to talk about left populism. It was a hell of a lot of fun. So make sure you check that out if you missed it. But I am thrilled to be joined once again by our friend Chip Gibbons. Chip Gibbons is a journalist and policy director at Defending Rights and Dissent. How are you doing, friend?
I'm well. How about you? And thank you for having me on. I love doing this program.
I'm pretty good. The air's relatively clean here, which a lot of our friends.
Well, yeah, not in DC. We have smoky air, so.
I hope it's not been too bad. Some of the pictures friends have been sending me have been pretty harrowing.
It doesn't look as scary as New York, but it is like sort of, hazy outside. Hello, whoever just said Chip, exclamation point.
And yeah, as folks know, we're hanging out. We're going to be talking a little bit about Ed Snowden, Assange, and maybe some of this Roger Waters controversy in a second. But as people know, these are a little bit more interactive. So feel free to jump in with questions. Try to sort of keep them on topic, at least while Chip's here. But afterwards, we can go wherever you want. But Chip, I mean, I want to talk about Snowden in a second, but you were just telling me there's a kind of unfortunate update in the Julian Assange case. If you could just take us.
Yeah. So this morning we learned that a judge on the British High Court has denied Julian Assange's extradition appeal. My understanding is that there are still legal options in the UK. They can still appeal to like a two-judge panel. I'm not an expert on the US court system, but I know with like the circuit courts, for example, you get a panel of judges, and if you don't like their ruling, you can appeal to the sort of full circuit. I believe it's something similar to that. And at that point, if that goes in a bad direction, there's always the sort of European Court of Human Rights. But the ball is increasingly in the U.S.'s court, and I really appreciate that Tlaib and Omar and Bowman and AOC and Cori Bush and Anna Presley and others, sent that letter to Merrick Garland calling for the charges to be dropped. But you're really not hearing a lot in Washington or from Congress besides that about this issue. And it is, it's interesting because around the world, there's a lot of attention to the Assange case, increasingly in Australia. This is increasingly becoming a diplomatic issue between the Australian government and the U.S. The current Australian Prime Minister has stated he's frustrated. The previous Australian Prime Minister, who was a conservative, has also joined in support of bringing Julian Assange home. Even people in Australia who don't like Assange or don't like what he did have really become sick of what the U.S. is doing. And Caroline Kennedy, the U.S. ambassador to Australia, had to meet with Australian parliamentarians. And everyone knew that had Biden gone to Australia, this would have been a huge issue for him. But conveniently, he was able to get out of that because of the debt ceiling, which I've heard some murmurings that maybe that wasn't the debt ceiling wasn't the reason he canceled. I don't really know that. I'm not convinced of that, but I mean, people are talking like that because it's that level of pressure that's coming out of Australia. And it is very bizarre to see both the FBI making public noise on this and now this ruling coming out at a time when it seems like the Australians are clearly frustrated with this case and what we're doing.
And I mean, and as they should be. I mean, we've had you on a lot to talk about, Assange and this political persecution of him. But I mean, like one thing that you could imagine is infuriating the Australian government is, I mean, like this is such an egregious power grab. The United States government extraditing someone, who's not a citizen, was not operating in the United States, to harass them and jail them for journalism is pretty extreme.
And it's gone on forever, and he's in bad health. I mean, I think the Australian government is publicly pulling more humanitarian type grounds than the press freedom grounds, but obviously those two are intertwined. But I mean, there is a cross party. I mean, every party in the Australian Parliament has a member in the Bring Julian Home group, and my understanding is it includes people who think this is a major press freedom issue too. This is our citizen, and this has gone on too long, and you're killing him. Mm-hmm. Governments tend to not like it when you torment their citizens. We're a bit of an exception on this one. We seem to allow other governments to torment our people if they're the right government. Mm-hmm. Saudi Arabia, or the Nicaraguan Contras, or the Israeli government, or Pinochet. You can kill a U.S. journalist or assassinate a former Chilean diplomat outside of DuPont Circle, and it's fine. But generally doesn't go over well when you kill other people's citizens.
Yeah. Well, I mean, we'll be watching that, and hopefully there's more good news. There's good news coming down the pipe. I mean, it's a tough situation, but I wanted to, we wanted to talk a little bit today about Ed Snowden, because it's been 10 years since his releases came out, and I mean, I want to talk a little bit about like what's going on today with him, but I feel like particularly for like some of our younger audience, I mean, like he's a very well-known name, but sometimes I feel like, particularly when I talk to younger people, it's like people don't really understand exactly what happened and what he did. So could you give people a general sense of like what were in these the Snowden files and the whole process at the beginning?
10 years is a long time. I was at an event before this, and someone was telling me they were in middle school when the Snowden revelations came out. I was like, God damn it, I was in law school. Don't tell me you were in middle school in 2013. And they had never even heard about the 2005 James Risen NSA revelations, right? So 10 years ago this week, the 5th, 6th, and 7th of June are the big days where The Guardian and the Washington Post start publishing these revelations based on, hello, Marcus the cat is here. Thank you, congressional baseball fan. I don't terribly care for Congress or baseball, but I'm sure I like you.
Well, you might like this kind of baseball. I'll just fill you in later.
Okay. But anyways, so the first thing that the Guardian, Glenn Greenwald, publishes at the Guardian, this secret order from the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Court, FISC, because everything has a fucking acronym. FISC, the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Court, which is this secret court where the defense is not, where there's no defense present and you're not notified of anything. The FBI went to the FISC court and got an order that Verizon had to turn over all of the telephone records of its customers on a daily basis to the NSA. This included information like who called who, how long the call was for, and it was for a daily basis. And it was specifically for domestic calls, like both calls from Americans overseas, but also calls from Americans to other Americans. And we had gotten various revelations from the Bush years, from the 70s with telegrams. I don't know, that seems so foreign to me, but they basically did all this same shit with telegrams in the 60s and 70s, which I imagine having your telegram read is quite upsetting, but it's such a foreign concept to me. Although I'm sure there's some people who are listening. If I told them how I used to use AOL Instant Messenger, they would, that'd be like saying I used to use a telegram. But anyways, but these were purely domestic calls, right? And they were getting all of these call records. And the legal authority for this was Section 215 of the Patriot Act, which has since thankfully sunsetted and will hopefully never come back. And it's really interesting in a darkly hilarious way, because Section 215, when the Patriot Act was proposed, it gives the government the right to collect like business records and tangible things. People were really upset about that because they thought it would allow the government to get their library books checkouts. Like this is one that got the librarians very angry, and people were livid about Section 215 when it was proposed, but nobody ever talked about like this could lead to the government having all the metadata of all Verizon customers, right? So like it's fascinating how the discussion in 2001 was all about library books, which is bad. Do not get me wrong. Very bad. and it was in fact everyone's metadata. And I think even the people who like pushed the Patriot Act were like, well, this isn't quite what we intended. And then after that, there was a story about an NSA program called PRISM. And the Verizon program, it's not the content of the calls, it's just the metadata. But PRISM, the NSA was working directly with Apple, Microsoft, Google, Yahoo, AOL, YouTube, in order to directly access those sorts of online communications. This is what's called downstream surveillance, which is where the NSA goes to a communications provider and can access it directly with the help of that corporation. Over the next couple of years, we sort of discover that the NSA also does what's called upstream surveillance, which is where they hack directly into the backbone of the internet. And I don't totally understand what that means. I'm a little bit technologically illiterate, but it sounds very bad when people say it. But under that, they just sort of grab all of the communications that go through that part of the internet. And both of these are just sort of legally allowed under Section 702, which was passed in 2008 under the FISA Amendments Act of 2008. And if I could just give some wonky history of this, basically the Bush administration was engaged in an illegal spying program. It was revealed by the New York Times. 51% of Americans said George W. Bush should be impeached for this spying, like this specific illegal spying, George Bush should be impeached for. The Democrats got control of both houses of Congress, and instead of impeaching George Bush, basically retroactively legalized a spying program and gave immunity to all of the telecoms companies. And I don't know if anyone but me remembers this, but when Obama was campaigning for the Democratic nomination against Hillary Clinton, which was far dirtier race than anything with Sanders, well, from the Obama-Clinton perspective. Obviously, the Clintons were quite dirty to Sanders, but there's always all this like Bernie bro stuff, and it's like, remember what Hillary Clinton's supporters were saying about Obama? I mean, it was
bad.
They came up with he was born in Kenya. That was Sidney Blumenthal who came up with that. But he said he was against telecom immunity, and then when he got the nomination, he voted for it. So real typical Democrat moment. You know, the Republicans have eviscerated democracy, brazenly acted illegally. The people are with you impeaching them. Let's just make it legal.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it's all about the process, friend. You know what I mean?
But this is so outrageous from a process standpoint, in that the Bush administration starts this program weeks before the Patriot Act, and their whole legal justification is like FISA is unconstitutional because it's too restrictive of the president, and the president has these inherent executive wartime powers. And then they go to the Congress and ask them to expand FISA surveillance under the Patriot Act. So they're really talking out of both sides of their mouth. But anyway, so Section 702, it's up for renewal this year. Hopefully it's not renewed. And what we eventually discover is that, I mean, the NSA is not allowed to intentionally intercept an American's communication without a warrant. The FBI can't read those communications without a warrant. But under 702, they suck up a bunch of data. And if they incidentally take your communications, they can store them and read them without a warrant. And that the FBI basically has been described as searching through this database as though it was Google. And just a couple weeks ago, we found out the FBI looked up the names of people arrested during the George Floyd uprising in this database of foreign intelligence collection. They looked up names of the January 6th participants in it. You know, and obviously there's a legitimate, you know, law enforcement interest in people who are trying to, you know, overthrow democracy. But I mean, that's not something you should be using foreign intelligence for. Like, that's a domestic law enforcement issue. They looked up a sitting member of Congress, and like every week there's a different sort of, you know, FBI sort of backdoor search scandal, and this continues to be a huge problem. And it's worth pointing out that, I mean, with the Black Lives Matter protesters and with the January 6th people, they were looking for foreign influence on those events. But, that was the basis for one of the worst FBI or NSA abuses of power in the 60s and 70s. They had a watch list where they would get names from the military, FBI, CIA, Secret Service. Overwhelming percentage of the names came from the FBI to try to prove foreign surveillance, try to prove foreign influence on racial extremists, mostly black extremists, FBI's language, not mine. And then also the anti-war movement. And then you look again, and they're trying to prove foreign influence on George Floyd protesters, who we know the FBI calls black separatist extremists. So it's very Hoover-like, this latest revelation.
Wow. I mean,
And that was just 2 weeks ago.
Yeah. Like that's the thing is like, that's one of the reasons that I wanted to sort of get the background in the history, because like the obvious question is, in your opinion, somebody who's been following, things like civil liberties and rights to privacy and things like that. I mean, I think there's a lot of things you can say that were like positive and change. For example, like there's more of a, people believe in the importance, for example, of like encryption for sending messages and things like that. But I mean, in your opinion, I mean, 10 years later, with the severity of these revelations and things that came out after, I mean, how would you sort of categorize the past 10 years when it comes to the subjects that Snowden sort of exposed back then?
I mean, 215 of the Patriot Act has been allowed to sunset. There was an attempt to reform it with the USA Freedom Act. That act was very controversial among civil liberties groups. Some supported it as a reform. Some were neutral on it, like the ACLU. Others opposed it, like my group. It turns out it wasn't much of a reform, and they continued doing the same thing. But, I mean, it is still very shocking. I mean, there is a lot of surveillance still going on. And the other thing about sort of the surveillance landscape where I sometimes get frustrated is that, I mostly write about the FBI, and they're mostly doing the old school sort of low-tech surveillance. And there is an incredible focus sometimes on the more high-tech stuff like Snowden exposed, but not a willingness to sort of grapple with the FBI low-tech surveillance of people. And there is a sort of unwillingness to sort of acknowledge the politics of mass surveillance, right? Going back to Hoover, going back to the first Red Scare or the Palmer raids or the Haymarket martyrs. I mean, there's a real conscious, Snowden is a hero to me. I'm sorry, I need to stop reading these out loud.
No, you can.
Well, I'm trying to talk. He is a hero. Yes, this is all correct. There's a counter-subversive, anti-radical. I mean, I'm writing this book on the FBI, and I got this document back through a lawsuit from August 2001. And what do you think they think the big terror threat is? It's anarchist and communist World Bank protesters because they killed President McKinley. As you recall, President McKinley famously killed at the Seattle World Trade Organization Minstrel Conference of 1999.
Yeah.
And it's August of 2001. And it's like, I'm really glad you FBI guys are finally getting around to solving the McKinley assassination. But it sort of goes back to the fact that none of this surveillance prevented 9/11. None of it prevented January 6th. And we always are told these lies that there isn't enough surveillance. The FBI has no power. I mean, there's this huge propaganda campaign after 9/11 that the FBI had become too much of a law enforcement agency and had let its intelligence apparatus as a trophy, or it didn't have the ability to do sort of widespread non-law enforcement intelligence collection. And as part of this lawsuit I have from my book, every month I get 500 pages of documents of their surveillance of World Bank protesters in the run-up to 9/11. And it's August of 2001, and they're going through the trash of the World Bank protest organizers. They investigated an incident at the airport involving alleged anti-World Bank anarchist in like August 2001. And it's like, I can think of some things happening at airports around that
Yeah.
time you probably should have paid attention to.
I mean, this is the kind of and you might have to zoom out a little bit, Chip, to to hear me, but like, there's like the dinner table conversation about Snowden. I remember the debates about Snowden, and Assange too. When a lot of these leaks were coming out, and like the excuses for it were always very, one, they were silly, but they're always very convenient. I have just a little quote here from our good friend of the show, John Bolton, who was in the Guardian, and I'm just I'm just going to read this right quick because it really does like embody a kind of argument that is always sort of thrown out about these things. John Bolton said about the Snowden leaks, that kind of leak can have a huge negative impact, not just on defense issues, but on diplomatic issues as well, because it reveals a lot of specifics and details that a foreign intelligence service could put together. And like this was like one of the things they were saying about Snowden. This is one of the things they were saying about Assange. Not that the problem was that the United States is like spying, one, on domestic citizens, and then two, on like allies in France. But rather that this is very embarrassing for America that this kind of thing comes out, which has always been. I mean, I get why John Bolton says that, right? Because this is very a personal affront to him. But for any kind of normal person who doesn't have like a connection or a need to defend these things, I've never understood why this gets so much room in people's heads.
No, and that's a really good point. And it's also worth pointing out that, I mean, I'm blanking on who it was. Was it James Clapper who said that the Snowden revelations were devastating because they sped up encryption by 7 years? But here's the thing. Do you really think Osama bin Laden does not think the NSA listens to his calls?
Yeah.
Like if he calls on an open line?
No,
I mean, it's like, oh no, now Al Qaeda will know. And it's like, Al Qaeda, like everyone knows you're going to try to listen to Al Qaeda. I mean, here's the thing, there's the incident where the U.S. believes Evo Morales has Snowden on his plane, and they forced the plane down.
Yes, yeah.
How that came to being was Julian Assange believed the U.S. government was listening to him. So he called people in the United States on an open line and said Snowden was going to be on that plane, knowing he wasn't.
Wow.
And what the fuck does the U.S. government do? They get Portugal to force the plane down, which, is a horrendous act of imperialism. But it also proves they're listening in on his calls.
Yeah.
I love I forget who it was, if it was Yahoo or what other news point. It's like, oh yeah, the intelligence community was always frustrated because WikiLeaks was so paranoid they couldn't hack their communications. And it's like, what do you mean they were paranoid? Yeah. Like, they think you're trying to hack their communications, and you are. That's not paranoia.
No, totally.
I do appreciate congressional baseball fan bringing up Condoleezza Rice. I always remember her very famous congressional testimony that, yes, there was a memo before 9/11, but it said something vague like bin Laden determined to attack inside America, which seemed rather specific to me. But
yeah, I mean, like this was such I'm just like, remembering like these moments, all the conversations that were going on around this time. And I want to talk a little bit about like Russia and where Snowden has been since. But I want to ask you a question as somebody who follows this closely, and correct me if I'm wrong, but like I remember like not many, but there were a few like notable exceptions in like the Republican movement, like the Republican Party, like both elected officials and people, maybe former elected officials, people with influence in DC, who also sort of would jump in. Not many, but like enough that that it was notable. And I remember that there was maybe this kind of potential grouping of people who were against, state surveillance. I mean, I just want to ask you, like, looking at the contemporary U.S. politics, I mean, has that sort of dissipated?
It's gotten really weird
Yeah.
post-Trump. I mean, the language about... I'm also very old, Jeffrey. I was telling someone that the Snowden revelations were out 10 years ago today, and they told me they were in middle school when they happened. And I'm like, well, I was in my second year of law school, so... Anyways, but no, I mean, I think a number of groups like R Street, I think, and Freedom Works, and then obviously the Cato Institute were all very upset about this surveillance. I know Ron Paul was a big Snowden supporter. He had to stop campaigning for a pardon for Edward Snowden because Rand Paul thought it would hurt his chance to be president, because Rand Paul was such a serious presidential contender. You know, that his father's one of the few things, like his father being right about something, you know, might hurt his chances to be president. But I don't know. It's so weird because, I mean, you have this sort of Republican Party that is very cynically discussing surveillance around Trump and Russia, and you know, some of their grievances are real, but some of their grievances are clearly invented. But this language is like, the FBI's gone woke, and never before have people been spied on since MLK. Like between MLK and Donald Trump, no surveillance. And then you have the Democrats, like that horrible delegate from is it the Virgin Islands or whatever?
I believe so, yeah. I'm trying
who is the lead Democrat on the weaponization of government committee here. I don't want to go off about that committee, but and you know, during her opening remarks, she's like, Republicans are criticizing the FBI, but who doesn't remember their response to the attack on our homeland after 9/11? And she used the phrase homeland. And I'm like, I do remember the FBI's response to the attack on our home, and I think we should have more attacks on the FBI's character and conduct.
No, and I mean, like, you know, there were all these leaks about like how they were planting agents in mosques around the country, convincing lonely, you know, and sometimes disturbed people to, you know, maybe join an organization completely fabricated, doing nothing but, you know, entrapping, you know, sort of isolated individuals. I mean, like, just like some of the most brutal stuff that, you know, not to be rosy as we know about what this country is, but like, it's just crazy sometimes, you know, to like look at that picture of what is actually going on with the security state in America. And how like it can, you know, like these things come up to the surface every once in a while. People are upset, but more and more I find that the kind of response we're getting from the public is just this kind of resigned acceptance, or like, I already knew that, right? Which is really devastating.
There is a subset of people who have certainly just sort of accepted surveillance as sort of normal. I think that's a really niche left phenomena. I think if I went outside and started telling people about like Fred Hampton and COINTELPRO, they'd look at me like crazy. But like in the left spaces, when you start to bring up these issues, there's a dismissal. It's like, oh, we already know they do this. They killed Fred Hampton. And it's like, or it's like, okay, but aren't you still concerned about the latest revelations? Aren't you concerned? It's a real sort of nihilistic attitude where it's like nothing can be done about surveillance. Civil liberties are all a mirage. Democracy is a facade, so none of these things are worth paying attention to or defending. And it was like some of the really weird conversations about security culture around like permitted protests, like don't take your cell phone to the don't take your cell phone to the Planned Parenthood protest with multiple members of Congress that's designed to get journalists to take photos of it. The government death squads will come kill you. And it's like, I am very paranoid about what the government's doing, but like, this is not an accurate message to send a person with 5 DPRK flags on Twitter, which, you know, maybe I shouldn't be looking at their tweets, but
well, I mean,
putting them into my Twitter feed or log or timeline.
Well, we're being forced to see even those ones, right? Even if we're not looking for them now.
My Twitter For You tab is just all anti-Roger Waters propaganda and like Nakba denialism and like the same like group of like hard right pro-apartheid defenders. And I'm always like, I can't believe someone I'm following is so pro-apartheid that I look not following them. Just Elon Musk is just putting them in, you know, in my Twitter.
I'm getting the kookiest like Texas Republican characters, which probably is good for my like journalism, but it's not good for my.
I'd trade you. I'm tired of reading like Blake Flayton's tweets.
That's fair.
I'll trade you like a good old kook. Like, look, I mean, I grew up in a really right wing suburb. We elected a member of the League of the South. Who bought dinosaur fossils to prevent them from going to like a museum that that like would say the dinosaurs weren't on Earth when man was on Earth. And he had like a public forum, and they asked it's county council. They asked him, what time should the school start? Because teenagers, their brains can't get up so early. And I was like, it doesn't matter what time the schools start. What matters is that they're teaching the children that they evolved from primordial ooze. He also had this article on his website about how basically people whose kids were killed in school shootings had it coming, because there's four types of government. There's 4 types of government, Dave. There's church government, family government, civil government, and God's government. And that school is part of family government, but public schools put it in like government.
Mm-hmm.
And that by mixing the spheres of government, you're bringing violence on yourself.
You're not being a good evangelist if you're afraid of fossils, because as I've been told many times by some of the more extreme Southern Baptists that I know, the fossils are put in the earth by the devil. It's a test of faith to reject them. So, have some courage.
Museum. He sent them to the Creation Museum or something.
Yeah. Well, I want to get to the Roger Waters stuff in just a sec, because I think it's.
You don't want to talk about fossils? You want to talk about fossils?
What about fossils?
You don't want to talk about fossils for the rest of the day?
I'm sorry. But before we get there, I think I want you to sort of talk about Snowden and Russia, because this is when we had you on with Assange, we made this point, right? That, there's things floating around, folks, and them on purpose, because there's a direct attempt for some, with Snowden, he definitely deserves a pardon. It doesn't seem like there's a lot of political motivation to do something about that, but the attacks on him continue, and they've popped up again this past week on the 10-year anniversary. Could you talk about what he was facing, right, when he had to sort of take exile in Russia? Because I think because what drives me nuts is when you hear these kind of right-wing talking heads on CNN or whatever talking about Snowden now, and they'll be like, well, he hates America so much he went to Russia, right? And it's like, well, you're leaving out why he couldn't come back to the United States.
Can I send you a clip, and can you play it? Or
I'll see if I can send it to me.
Okay, hold on. I'm gonna send you something on this topic. It is the my friend, the former deputy director of the NSA. I'm not friends with him. Explaining the why Snowden is in Russia question. And he actually answers, which is hilarious to me.
I mean, oh yeah, you're grabbing it.
I'm sorry. Yes, it's hyperlinked in my Jacobin article that's coming out tomorrow. But I don't know if you can get this to play or not.
I can get it to play. Just give me 1 second.
Sure. But no, so basically Snowden is aware of a case with an NSA whistleblower called Thomas Drake. Drake is indicted under the Espionage Act for pretty false charges, basically, and the government's case against him falls apart. But he goes bankrupt trying to defend him, successfully defending himself, but goes bankrupt. And Snowden knows he cannot stay in the U.S. He goes to Hong Kong, which is always fascinating to me because the U.S. is so interested in Hong Kong, and it's such a free place. Okay, such a free place, free from the CCP, and we have to sanction China. But then it's oh, he was in Hong Kong. That's basically China, and it's you can't have it both ways. But it's pretty clear to me and everyone else that Snowden is trying to go to Latin America. WikiLeaks sends someone, Sarah Harrison, to Hong Kong to sort of help Snowden apply for asylum. An Ecuadorian consular official in London grants Snowden safe passage on behalf of Ecuador. The Ecuadorian government revokes that. But there's no direct flight to Latin America from Hong Kong, right? You need to stop basically in Moscow and then probably Havana, which is what people believed he was doing. And do you remember all the journalists who got on the plane to Havana? Do you remember this at all? Or so
I remember the spectacle of it, but I don't remember any of the
journalists
details.
thought he was en route to Latin America, so they all bought tickets on this plane they thought he was on, and they all got stranded in Cuba, which I think there's worse places to get stranded in. But Ben Rhodes revealed in his book that they pressured Cuba not to let Snowden pass through. The U.S. canceled his passport when he was in Russia. Biden personally called, then Vice President Biden, now President Biden, personally called Rafael Correa and told him not to grant Snowden asylum the way they did Assange. And when they think he's on Evo Morales' plane, they force the plane down.
Mm-hmm.
So, I mean, Snowden was not trying to go to Moscow. He was trying to go to Latin America. It's not known where. I think most observers think it's Ecuador. I think it's Ecuador. I don't know that, but the evidence is pretty strong in favor of Ecuador. Do you want to play that quote from Inglis?
Let's play
former
this.
Deputy Director of the NSA. This is an amazing quote. Is there sound? I don't think there's sound, Dave.
Sorry. Let me try again.
Yeah. I think that man should be talking. His lips are moving.
Yeah, no, my bad.
Yes, his entire...
What is...
Fuck. I'm sorry. I had to do something. I got it. Just 1 second. Sorry,
Sure.
friends.
I'll entertain people. I'll read them Proust or something. Okay.
What is the formal belief of why Snowden did what he did? Was he acting as an agent of a foreign government, or was he self-recruited to just do what he did for whatever reason?
First, I have to point out that I don't represent the United States government anymore. I'm no longer in an official capacity, and so I wouldn't know what the official position of the U.S. government is any more than I would know the absolute truth of what Snowden's thinking was and all the machinations that he went through to do what he did. But here's what I surmise based upon a careful observation of the facts available to me. It does seem clear that his intention was to go to Latin or South America after he revealed all this material in Hong Kong. He worked very hard, and his lawyers worked very hard on his behalf to actually achieve that in the days and weeks afterwards. Doesn't seem to me that a destination of China or Russia would be preferred. This was something that was done on the fly. It wasn't carefully thought through. I can't imagine that his plan A was to arrive in Moscow and essentially be in virtual isolation in a foreign country. It probably is a nice enough place to be, but it's not home. So I don't think that he was in the employ of the Chinese or the Russians. I don't see any evidence that would indicate that. And even if they're careful in terms of practicing denial and deception, I think there would be certain telltales in there that would work out more crisply, more cleanly, separate and apart from where he's wound up.
Wow.
That's an astonishing clip. That is an astonishing, and that's the former Deputy Director of the NSA, who's not a fan of Edward Snowden. He hates the Oliver Stone Snowden movie. This was like his other thing. Like, he got to come around and do interviews about how he wasn't accurately portrayed in the Oliver Stone movie.
Well, I mean, like, I have to say, I do remember when I was living in DC, you meet like low level people in government, and the vitriol that people had towards not just Snowden, but when that movie came out. I was bartending at the time, and like, remember this guy would come and hang out with us all the time, just losing his goddamn mind about how what Snowden had done to him personally, which is just so amazing.
I grew up 10 minutes from Fort Meade, which is where the NSA is at. Like, I literally grew up like 10 minutes from the NSA. So I know the attitude you're talking about. Although I actually think they're worse in DC with like low-level wannabe political apparatchik
Yeah, I think so.
than like intelligence people. I met someone in DC a couple months ago who told me how in his free time he watches videos of Russian soldiers being killed, because if you fuck around, you find out. And I didn't bring up Iraq or Afghanistan. I think that'd be a little bit too much. But I said, well, do you do that for Yemen or Palestine?
Yeah.
And he goes, well, Palestine's very complex.
Oh, of course. It's always complex.
And I'm
right?
like, oh, okay.
Mighty Mito Maria wants to know, where's Snowden these days and how well is he doing? Also, the Doves UK wrote a song weirdly called Snowden in the early 2000s that spoke eerily to the subject.
Snowden is still in Moscow. He's married and has children. And I think he is trying to live as normal-ish of a life as you can when you are a political exile responsible for the largest revelations about the most powerful superpowers, most secretive spy agency.
Yeah. And he has Russian citizenship now, if
Yeah,
I'm
he
correct.
does. Yes,
And
that
with
was a
that, and again, like this is somebody who sort of gets isolated and pushed in there. Correct me if I'm wrong about this, Chip, but like I remember everyone was making a big deal about like Snowden pledging allegiance to Russia. But I reckon that's probably like what you do when you get citizenship, just like you do in the United
I
States.
mean, yeah, I mean, I don't know anything about the Russian citizenship
Well, I'm
process.
just saying because all the headlines weren't like, "Oh, Snowden gets Russian citizenship." It was like Snowden renounces America and pledges allegiance to Russia, right? Which again,
Now this U.S. citizenship. I mean, imagine if you did a story about like an Iraqi permanent resident or green card holder who got you like citizen of country devastated by 40 years of American imperialism, causing millions of his fellow countrymen to die, swears allegiance to world's most murderous empire. I mean,
yeah.
that would be quite a headline. And no one would run it because it'd be stupid.
Yeah.
Right? It'd be an idiotic headline to run.
No. I mean, it's just like it's just amazing the kind of journalism malpractice when it comes to Assange and Snowden generally. Though I think, praise it where it's good, but there's a lot of bad out there. And Mighty Mito Maria also says like, and then look what they did to Evo. He had to run for his life, and like I think that it's important to remember. We've covered Evo Morales on this program a lot over the years. Like, don't ever forget. There's no doubt about it that the coup attempt against him and a lot of the support you got in the United States of that process, not unrelated to his role in defending press
look at
freedom.
the countries they thought Snowden might go to. Ecuador, where Rafael Correa was president and granted asylum to Assange. Look what happens in Ecuador. A new government comes in, they betray Correa, they give Assange up. Bolivia, a coup. Venezuela, they're trying to, do a regime change there. They're not very good at it. But,
Brazil too. Brazil, not as like direct, but Lula, somebody who will speak up for these people, and they hated him for that for years. You know what I mean? Like the arm of the U.S. state is longer than I think people give it credit for sometimes. The memory, I guess, the memory is very it's very punitive and vindictive. But I mean, talking about vindictive, I mean, in the last couple of minutes, Chip, I mean, you wrote this piece in Jackman. I'll pull it up for people to read. But this Roger Waters saga, I know we were talking about it before, and you might have said something a lot on this on Twitter too. It's like you thought this was going to be over, a little flash in the pan story, but it's stuck around. I mean, could you talk about what the controversy is about Roger Waters? And
sure. So Roger Waters is the former member of Pink Floyd, has an incredible, historically acrimonious departure from Pink Floyd. He is also a very prominent supporter of Palestinian rights, a number of left-wing anti-war causes. We should negotiate with Putin over Ukraine, things like that, and obviously has a very large group of haters who have continuously tried to have his shows canceled on both claims he's anti-Semitic or sort of pro-Putin. Pink Floyd in 1979 released an album called The Wall. Apparently that's a surprise to some people these days. It was also the subject of a 1982 film, also called The Wall. And in it, there is this famous series of images about sort of the protagonist has this psychotic break and envisions himself as a fascist demagogue. Apparently The Wall is quite popular in Israel, by the way. And there is a Israeli Pink Floyd cover band who performs The Wall, and they perform it the same way Roger Waters got in trouble for performing it. As part of his performance of these songs where he is the fascist demagogue, he wears this leather trench coat that is, leather trench coats are very Nazi looking. It has the sort of fictional symbols of the fascist movement that I think are from the movie of these sort of crossed hammers, and they sort of lower all these crossed hammer banners, and they float a pig around the audience that says "fuck the Mother Daddy, fuck the poor, right? These are like fascistic slogans, and it's very clearly like not pro-fascism. Like this would be like watching Charlie Chaplin's The Great Dictator and thinking, Hitler,
Yeah.
Or seeing Bertolt Brecht's The Irresistible Rise of Uwe Boll. This character makes a lot of sense. And in addition to this sort of performance as a fascist demagogue, earlier in the show, he does a song called The Powers That Be that features sort of imagery of police violence and lists the names of various people who have been murdered by racist or repressive regimes. So it will say like George Floyd murdered in Minneapolis, crime, being black, sentenced death. And they do that for a bunch of people all around the world. I have a list of a whole bunch of names in the Jacobin piece. And when doing this in Berlin, he included the names of 2 victims of the Nazi regime. Sophie Scholl, who was a college student and political activist who gave out anti-war leaflets and was killed by guillotine. And this is an interesting fact. The guillotine man was a professional executioner who then went on to execute many Nazis during Nuremberg. Because he was just the German state executioner, and apparently you can have the career of executioner, and it doesn't matter if you're working for the Third Reich or Nuremberg, and nothing bad happens to you. I find that rather disturbing. And then Anne Frank, who was a teenager who died in a concentration camp, for the sole fact that she was Jewish, and the Nazis were a genocidal regime. And it makes a lot of sense to put that those 2 names in that montage, because these are people who are refugees, who were murdered by Belgian police. These are black people who were killed by U.S. And he also includes the name of a Palestinian journalist, which, as you know, is the most offensive thing you can do, to say that a Palestinian journalist wearing a press jacket shot by an Israeli sniper, that was intentional.
Yeah, I mean, like, this is, the thing that's so shocking about this is, like, one, like, I think your piece is really wonderful because it, like, lays it all out. But, like, any reasonable person can come to the conclusion. One, like, you don't even, like, just the fact that this has been going on for a long time. This isn't, like, a new idea that's just sort of cooked up recently. But, I mean, could you, like, for people who, like...
He's done this 630 times. I looked it up. He's done this
Wow.
630 times since 1980. And there's a movie.
So...
And when the Berlin Wall came down, he was invited to do this at the side of the Berlin Wall.
Wow. Well, I mean,
it's very popular in Israel.
Yeah, well, I mean, I mean, I want, like, people to understand.
They might think it's pro-fascist there. I don't know.
What?
They might think it's pro-fascist there. Who knows?
You never know. But, like, like, could you tell people who, like, may have been lucky to sort of miss this cultural moment how, because it wasn't just a bunch of weird people on Twitter. I mean, the condemnations were widespread. The slander was thrown about by, like, a lot of, bigger names and, like, institutions and things like this. Like, it was a real assault on Rogers, on his character.
Yeah, so a bunch of pro-Israel and sort of pro-army in Ukraine, endlessly without restriction accounts, started circulating that Roger Waters in Berlin had dressed up as a Nazi SS officer. That's not true. He wore a leather trench coat with a fictional fascist symbol on it, fired a gun, right? Because I don't know how familiar you are with this song In the Flesh, but the closing lines are, "Who let all this riffraff into the room? If I had my way, I'd have you all shot." Flew a pig balloon with a Star of David on it, which did not happen at the Berlin show and happened over a decade ago. And the ADL said it was not anti-Semitic, and we should focus on the real anti-Semitism, his support for Palestinians, which is a very telling quote. Yes, and Roger Waters' father was killed by the Nazis. That is true.
Mm-hmm.
I talk about it in my Jacobin piece because that's a huge influence on his anti-war, anti-fascist perspective. And that he did this all while insulting Anne Frank and minimizing the Holocaust.
Yeah.
And we saw the nation state of Israel tweet this out. The nation state of Ukraine replied that Roger Waters was once a rock idol. Now he's a rock bottom. These are the blue checkmark accounts of nation states.
Mm-hmm.
We saw the EU anti-Semitism commissioner call for him to be prosecuted, and then the U.S. State Department ambassador on anti-Semitism retweet that person from an official account. And then Sam Husseini and the AP diplomatic reporter have asked the State Department for comment on that. And this week, the State Department is doubling down. A member of the British Parliament has called for Roger Waters' concerts to be banned in the UK. When somebody pointed out to him on Twitter, I believe it was Alex Nunn, that his facts were wrong, he blocked them. And now Keir Starmer. Lovely Keir Starmer has joined in with calling for Roger Waters' concerts to be banned in the United Kingdom. Roger Waters, this is my favorite part of this account, is somebody took a video of Roger Waters giving an anti-Semitic speech in London as part of the concert. And this is my favorite part, because it's just a totally normal speech, being like, you did this to Jeremy Corbyn. You're doing this to me. We don't desecrate Anne Frank's name. We talk about her as a martyr. She was killed by a racist regime. Stop lying about me. And you know, there's so many fascinating low moments, because he like put out this statement being like, people are lying. And it's like, oh, or they're lying. It's like, who's the they, Roger? Who's the they?
Oh my God.
And it's like, the people, well, it's like, oh, you're saying people are lying. That's an anti-Semitic stereotype. And it's like, this is like, it's,
yeah, I mean, it was just such it's a really frightening,
it's disinformation.
it's
And there's this
100%
entire
disinformation. Yeah.
cottage industry that all it does is tell us how bad disinformation is on Twitter. And they're all absolutely fucking silent on this, because the disinformation, this might be shocking, the disinformation industry, the counter-disinformation industry, is a fraudulent industry designed to like silence people on Twitter that criticize U.S. foreign policy. Right? It's not a real thing. Not really honest people are in the counter-disinformation industry.
No, and I mean, like, it's just frightening to see, like, in real time, you know, like false narrative building being like this. Something that's easily, any reasonable person can look at this and fact check it. It's great that you do it, you know, extensively in your piece, but like you see something like this, and like how effective that you know government accounts, big public figures can be in sort of, you know, creating these really dangerous false narratives against somebody. And like, I'll say it, you know, I don't think you'd be scared to say it either. It's like 100% because of his position on Palestinian human rights. It's 100% because of his position
And
on
Ukraine.
the
It's
war
Ukraine.
in
It's
Ukraine.
NATO people too. The NATO people are involved in this as well. You know, and it's just like the media reports their things uncritically. It's like, I mean, I spent my weekend watching the video of the concert and comparing it to what was described. Like, anyone at BBC could have done that. They have a whole team of people who could do that. But they just print what these liars are saying. And, you know, when I published the Jacobin piece, there's all these people just tweeting, again, the picture of him in the leather jacket. There's a bunch of people being like, Chip Gibbons isn't your real name. Or one person, oh, I have to read this comment that I got. This is a great one.
We're here for it.
I
mean,
so Chip Gibbons is a suitably silly name for a clearly dishonest author, too clearly, so they need an editor, willing to be the jester of misinformation at the behest of an infamously narcissistic rock and roller who's devolved to become the authoritarian monster Pink Floyd warned of. Chip Gibbons is a suitably silly name for a clearly dishonest author, clearly willing to be the jester of misinformation at the behest of an infamously narcissistic rock and roller who's devolved into the authoritarian monster Pink Floyd warned us about.
It's really, really next level stuff. It's hard to wrap your head around.
I got someone just tweeting out, you know, I bet Chip Gibbons likes to dress up in Nazi uniforms too.
No, and like, you know, I mean, talk about disinformation, friends. I mean, like, it's again, and like, this is the thing that is so worrying, because, you know, we started talking about the way that like the government is actually spying on American citizens. Assange obviously shows the brutality of American war crimes, and then you have this years long movement right now to get worked up about disinformation, and effectively what that has been how can we get a hammer to use against people who take anti-war positions? How can we have a hammer to use against people who think that apartheid should end? I mean, the slide and how normalized this has become should be something that worries any sane or rational person.
And it's very clear they sit in a Discord chat together. Like, I've been Chip Gibbons for 33 years, and like I have 4 people on like 2 platforms. Like, that's a silly name. I've never gotten that. Maybe it is a silly name. I don't know. I've never gotten it before. Or one time I posted something about Ukraine assassinating someone. Like, I don't know, assassination seemed bad. I had all these people in my message mentioned same thing. Like, no followers, no one following them, only tweet about Ukraine. All of the same talking point. Like, oh, you write for Jacobin and you're criticizing political violence, which was like mildly clever the first time this one person following account gave it to me, and then the next 3 times like increasingly diminishing returns.
No, it's true. It's true.
And it's like you're clearly sitting in a Discord.
Yeah.
Like,
no,
100%. Oh, don't go outside. It's smoky outside. Like, touch grass. Touch grass. This is what I'm gonna do. I'm gonna get off this live stream. I'm gonna ride out to Langley, and I'm gonna walk up to the CIA and say, "Touch grass, PSYOPs division."
There you go. Well, we won't delay you in that plan. Chip Gibbons, it's always a pleasure chatting with you.
Always a pleasure to be on.
There are links below to follow Chip's excellent work. We always love talking to Chip, and you should definitely be following them on Twitter and keeping up with the work at Defending Rights and Dissent if you aren't already. Thanks again, friend.
Have a good one.
All right, folks. We'll be back this Sunday. We're going to be talking about rural America and the right and the left. It's going to be a lot of fun. So join us then, and I'll see y'all soon.